Steve Harvey was ordering his morning coffee when he saw a teenager being humiliated by three grown men. What he did next wasn't just caught on camera. It went viral with 47 million views and changed that kid's life forever. It was a Tuesday morning in October 2019 at a small coffee shop called Brewster's on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles. The kind of place where struggling actors, writers, and regular working people grab their caffeine fix before facing another day in the city of dreams. Steve Harvey had stopped in around 6:45 a.m., wearing a simple gray hoodie and baseball cap, trying to stay under the radar before heading to a morning taping of Family Feud. The shop was moderately busy with the usual morning rush. Business people checking their phones, a couple of college students hunched over laptops, and the steady hiss of the espresso machine providing background noise to the low hum of conversation. Steve stood in line, third from the counter, scrolling through his phone and minding his own business. That's when he heard it. A voice, stuttering, struggling to get words out. I'd like a medium C coffee with. The teenager at the counter was maybe 16 or 17 years old, tall and lanky, with a mop of curly brown hair. He wore a backpack over one shoulder and clutched a $5 bill in his trembling hand. His face was flushed red as he tried to complete his order, the words catching in his throat like they were physically stuck there. Behind him in line stood three men in their late 20s, dressed in expensive workout gear, the kind of guys who spent more time at the gym than they did being decent human beings. And they were laughing. Not quietly, not discreetly, loudly. "Bro, we're gonna be here all day," one of them said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Maybe he should have practiced his order at home," another one chimed in, and all three of them burst into laughter. The teenager's shoulders hunched forward. His hand gripped the $5 bill tighter. He tried again. Medium coffee." "Dude, spit it out already," the third guy said, making exaggerated stuttering sounds. "Come on." More laughter. Cruel, mocking laughter that cut through the morning atmosphere like a knife. The barista, a young woman with kind eyes and purple-streaked hair, looked mortified. She clearly wanted to help the kid, but didn't know what to do about the grown men acting like middle school bullies. "Take your time, honey," she said gently to the teenager. "There's no rush." But the damage was already done. The kid's eyes were starting to water. He was on the verge of just running out of the shop, abandoning his order and his dignity along with it. That's when Steve Harvey stepped out of line. He didn't rush. He didn't make a scene. He simply walked past the three men, positioned himself right next to the teenager at the counter, and said in that unmistakable voice, "Excuse me, young man. I couldn't help but notice you're trying to order. Mind if I help?" The teenager looked up, and his eyes went wide. Even through his embarrassment, he recognized who was standing next to him. I'm just a guy trying to get coffee," Steve said with a warm smile. Then he turned to the barista. "My young friend here would like a medium coffee. How do you take it, son?" The teenager, still shaking, but now with a glimmer of hope in his eyes, managed to whisper, "B black, 2 sugars." "Medium coffee, black, 2 sugars," Steve repeated to the barista. "And I'll take a large black coffee, no sugar. We're together. I got this." He pulled out a $20 bill and handed it to the barista, then turned around to face the three men behind them. The shop had gone completely silent. Everyone was watching now. Some people had recognized Steve Harvey. Others were just drawn to the tension in the air. Steve looked at the three men with an expression that wasn't angry. It was worse than angry. It was disappointed. Like a father who'd caught his sons doing something shameful. "Gentlemen," Steve said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to think real carefully before you answer." The three men shuffled their feet. Their smug grins had vanished. They knew they'd been caught, and they knew exactly who had caught them. "Do y'all feel good right now?" Steve continued. "Does it make you feel strong, powerful, making fun of a kid who's just trying to order coffee?" Silence. One of the men opened his mouth like he was going to say something, then thought better of it. Steve wasn't done. What y'all don't understand, what you clearly never learned, is that everybody's fighting a battle you know nothing about. This young man right here, he's got more courage in his little finger than the three of you combined. Steve placed his hand on the teenager's shoulder. You know how I know that? Because he walked into this coffee shop knowing he might struggle with his words. He knew people might stare. He knew he might get embarrassed. But he came in anyway. He didn't let his fear stop him. That's what real strength looks like. The teenager was crying now. But these were different tears. Not tears of shame, but tears of relief, of being seen, of being defended. Steve turned back to the three men. Now let me tell you something about me. I grew up poor in Cleveland, Ohio. Dirt poor. And I had a stutter too. You could hear the collective intake of breath from everyone in the coffee shop. This was information Steve Harvey had never shared publicly before. That's right, Steve continued. From the time I was 7 until I was about 14 years old, I couldn't get through a sentence without stumbling over my words. You know what that's like? Being a kid with big dreams, wanting to make people laugh, wanting to be heard, but your own mouth won't cooperate. The three men were looking at the floor now, unable to meet Steve's gaze. I got made fun of, daily. Kids at school, teachers who didn't understand, even some family members who thought I was just being difficult. It nearly destroyed me, nearly made me give up on every dream I ever had. Steve's voice got quieter, but somehow more powerful. You know what saved me? One person, just one. A teacher named Mrs. Robertson who took the time to work with me after school. She never made me feel broken. She never made me feel less than. She told me that my words would come when they were ready, and that when they did, they'd be worth waiting for. He paused, letting that sink in. That woman changed my life. And you three, you almost destroyed this young man's morning, maybe his whole day. Maybe even planted a seed of shame that could have followed him for years. Over what? 5 minutes of your precious time? One of the men finally spoke up, his voice small. Mr. Harvey, you didn't mean to be cruel, Steve cut him off. You didn't mean to humiliate a kid? Then what exactly were you trying to do with all that laughing and mocking? More silence. Here's what's going to happen, Steve said, his tone leaving no room for argument. You three are going to apologize to this young man. Not because I'm Steve Harvey and you're embarrassed you got caught, but because it's the right thing to do. And then you're going to think real hard about the kind of men you want to be. The barista had stopped making drinks. Other customers had their phones out, some recording, some just watching in awe. This wasn't celebrity Steve Harvey putting on a show. This was a man who'd lived through pain, standing up for someone experiencing that same pain. The first guy stepped forward. He looked genuinely ashamed now. I'm sorry, man. That was really messed up. We were being jerks. The second guy nodded. Yeah, I'm sorry too. No excuse for that. The third guy, who'd been the loudest with his mocking, seemed like he wanted to just disappear. But he forced himself to look at the teenager. I'm really sorry. What we did was wrong. The teenager, still standing next to Steve, wiped his eyes and nodded silently. He didn't trust his voice yet, but his acceptance was clear. Steve turned to the kid. You good, son? The teenager took a deep breath and in a voice that was steadier than before, said, Yeah, thank you. Don't thank me, Steve said. You stood your ground. You didn't run. That's all you. The barista brought over their coffees, and Steve noticed her eyes were wet too. She handed them over and whispered, Both are on the house, Mr. Harvey. Steve smiled and insisted on leaving the 20 in the tip jar anyway. As he and the teenager walked toward a table by the window, away from the other customers, Steve said, What's your name? Marcus Chen. Marcus. Good name. Strong name. You in school? Marcus nodded. Jay Jr. at Hamilton High. What do you want to do? After school, I mean. Marcus's face lit up despite the tear stains. I want to be a lawyer. Help people. Steve smiled, really smiled. A lawyer. That's perfect. You know why? Marcus shook his head. Because lawyers use their words to fight for people who can't fight for themselves. And you, Marcus, you're going to be great at that. You already know what it feels like to struggle, to be underestimated. That's going to make you powerful in ways those guys out there will never understand. They sat down at the small table, and for the next 20 minutes, Steve Harvey and Marcus Chen just talked. Steve shared more about his own journey, the years of struggle, the times he wanted to quit, the moment he found his voice through comedy. He told Marcus about sleeping in his car when he was trying to make it as a comedian, about the rejection, about the people who told him he'd never make it. The stutter doesn't define you, Marcus, Steve said. It's just one part of your story. And sometimes the things we think are our biggest weaknesses, those become our greatest strengths, because they teach us empathy. They teach us resilience. They teach us that the only opinion that really matters is the one we have of ourselves. Marcus was absorbing every word like a plant soaking up sunlight. Can I tell you something? Marcus asked. Anything. I almost didn't come in today. I almost just skipped breakfast because I was tired of people looking at me like I'm broken. Steve's jaw tightened. Look at me, Marcus. You listening? Marcus met his eyes. You are not broken. You hear me? You are not broken. Your brain just works differently, and there is nothing wrong with that. Some of the most brilliant people in history had speech issues. Moses had a speech impediment. Did that stop him from leading his people? No, it made him stronger. It made him rely on something deeper than just words. Steve reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card. This is my personal assistant's number. I want you to call this number next week. We're going to get you connected with a speech therapist if you want one, on me. But more importantly, I want to stay in touch with you. Check in on how you're doing. Because I see something in you, Marcus. I see a fighter. Marcus took the card with shaking hands, not from nervousness this time, but from overwhelming emotion. Why are you doing this? He asked. Steve leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. When I was your age, when I was struggling with my words, I used to pray for someone to see me, really see me. Not the stutter, not the poor kid from Cleveland, but the person I was underneath all that. Mrs. Robertson did that for me, and it changed everything. So now that I have a platform, now that I have resources, now that I have a voice, I use it to be for other people what I needed when I was young. He pointed at Marcus. And someday, when you're a successful lawyer, when you're fighting for people in that courtroom, you're going to remember this morning, and you're going to pay it forward. You're going to see someone who's struggling, and you're going to be their voice. That's how this works. That's how we change the world, one act of kindness at a time. Marcus was full-on crying now, but he was also smiling. I promise I will. I know you will, son. I know you will. What neither Steve nor Marcus knew at that moment was that the barista, whose name was Sarah, had recorded most of their conversation on her phone. Not to exploit it, but because she'd been so moved by what she was witnessing. She posted it to her Instagram story with the caption, "This is what a real man looks like. Steve Harvey just restored my faith in humanity." Within 2 hours, the video had been shared thousands of times. By the end of the day, it had been picked up by news outlets across the country. By the end of the week, it had 47 million views and had gone global. People weren't just watching a celebrity being kind. They were watching a man who'd lived through pain, using his influence to prevent someone else from experiencing that same pain. They were watching generational trauma being interrupted. They were watching what it looks like when someone with power chooses empathy over ego. The three men from the coffee shop. Their social media accounts got flooded with comments after they were identified in the video. They issued public apologies, but more importantly, according to follow-up reports, all three of them started volunteering with anti-bullying organizations. One of them even became a mentor for kids with speech disorders. Marcus Chen became a minor celebrity himself. He was interviewed on local news, invited to speak at schools about bullying and perseverance. His stutter didn't magically disappear, but his confidence skyrocketed. He started a YouTube channel where he talked about his experiences and offered support to other kids struggling with speech issues. And true to Steve's promise, they stayed in touch. Steve brought Marcus to a taping of Family Feud 6 months later. When he introduced him to the studio audience and shared their story, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Marcus, standing on that stage next to his hero, spoke to the audience without a single stutter. Not because the condition was gone, but because he'd learned that his words had power regardless of how they came out. "Mr. Harvey taught me something that morning," Marcus said to the cameras. "He taught me that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and doing it anyway. And he taught me that the right kind of person in the right moment can change everything." Steve wrapped his arm around Marcus's shoulders. "And you taught me something too, Marcus. You reminded me why I do what I do. You reminded me that every single person we encounter is fighting a battle we know nothing about, and that the smallest act of kindness can ripple out in ways we can't even imagine." 3 years after that morning in the coffee shop, Marcus Chen graduated from high school as valedictorian. His speech, which he delivered flawlessly to a standing ovation, was titled "The Power of Being Seen." In it, he talked about that Tuesday morning in October, about the three men who tried to tear him down, and about the one man who built him back up. Steve Harvey was in the audience that day, watching the kid he defended become the young man he always knew he could be. When Marcus finished his speech and the crowd erupted in applause, Steve stood up first, tears streaming down his face, clapping harder than anyone else. After the ceremony, as they hugged in the parking lot, Marcus handed Steve a letter. "Don't read it now," Marcus said. "Read it later." That night, in his hotel room, Steve opened the letter. It was 3 pages long, written in Marcus's careful handwriting. It detailed every way that morning had changed Marcus's life. The therapy he'd gotten, the confidence he'd built, the friendships he'd formed, the bullying he'd prevented by sharing his story. But the last paragraph was what made Steve break down. It read, "You told me that morning that I wasn't broken. But the truth is, I was broken. Those men had broken something in me that I didn't even know was fragile. But you didn't just tell me I wasn't broken. You showed me how to put myself back together. You showed me that my voice matters, even when it shakes. You showed me that my worth isn't determined by how smoothly I speak, but by what I choose to say. I'm going to UCLA in the fall to study pre-law, and every time I stand up to defend someone who can't defend themselves, I'm going to remember that coffee shop. I'm going to remember that you didn't have to stop. You didn't have to care. But you did. And because you did, I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure your kindness wasn't wasted on me. Thank you for seeing me when I felt invisible. Thank you for hearing me when I couldn't find my words. Thank you for being the man I want to become." Steve Harvey kept that letter in his wallet. He still carries it today, because on a random Tuesday morning, in a coffee shop in Los Angeles, Steve wasn't trying to go viral. He wasn't trying to create a moment for social media. He was just trying to be the person he needed when he was 16 years old and scared and stuttering. And that's the thing about real kindness, about real courage, about real humanity. It doesn't calculate the cost or measure the impact. It just shows up. It just steps out of line when everyone else is staying silent. It just says that's enough when the world is being too cruel. The video of that morning has been viewed over 47 million times. It's been shown in schools, in churches, in corporate training sessions about empathy and leadership. It's been studied by psychologists and shared by parents trying to teach their kids about standing up for others. But for Steve Harvey and Marcus Chen, it will always be simpler than that. It will always just be a Tuesday morning when two people who needed each other found each other at exactly the right moment. When a kid learned he wasn't alone, and when a man remembered why his voice matters. That's the power of showing up. That's the power of speaking up. That's the power of one person deciding that another person's dignity is worth more than 5 minutes of convenience. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that one moment of courage can change someone's entire life, share it. Because somewhere out there, there's another Marcus who needs to know he's not broken. There's another person standing in line, afraid to speak, who needs someone to step up and say, "I got you." Be that person, because you never know when your Tuesday morning is going to become someone else's turning point. And that's how Steve Harvey, in a coffee shop on a random Tuesday, reminded all of us what it really means to be human.